The new assistant always had the right answer, and the CEO started trusting her too much. But if these numbers don't make sense right now, we end this here. The sentence landed in the room like a weight. Nobody moved. On the other side of the table, one of the investors kept his eyes fixed on the screen, cold, impatient, decided. "We're not here to gamble," he continued. "We're here to trust. And right now, I don't trust this." Silence. John Caldwell kept his posture straight, his composure firm. On the outside steady, on the inside something didn't fit. Not enough to back down, but enough to bother him. "The data is correct," he said with a steady voice. "The growth is consistent." "It doesn't look that way," another investor shot back. "It looks too optimistic." The mood grew heavier. One decision there could change everything. And it was exactly at that moment that the new assistant, Isabella Carter, leaned her body slightly forward. No rush, no drama. "Can I try something?" she asked in a light, almost casual tone. John looked at her, nodded sure. She picked up the tablet like it was just another simple task. 2 taps on the screen. The presentation changed. Cleaner charts, less clutter, more clarity. "Sometimes," she said with a small smile, "the problem isn't in the numbers, but in how they're being shown." The investors leaned forward. One of them narrowed his eyes. "Now, that makes sense." Another let out a light laugh. "Impressive." The mood started to shift. "See?" Isabella added lightly. "It wasn't wrong. It was just hard to see." Someone laughed. Then another. And within seconds, the weight in the room disappeared like it had never been there. John let out a slow breath. That had been close. He looked at Isabella. She just gave a small smile from the corner of her mouth. Quiet. Like someone who just handled something simple. And in that moment, he trusted her a little more. On the other side of the table, Victoria Hale did not smile. She wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at Isabella. No expression. Watching. The meeting ended with handshakes and formal agreements. The deal wasn't closed, but it wasn't lost either, and that was already a win. In the glass hallway, with the city stretching out below, John walked alongside Isabella. "You saved the meeting," he said, letting out a light laugh. She shrugged. "I just organized it." "No," he replied. "You made it look easy." She turned toward him with a calm look. "Sometimes it is." John shook his head, still impressed. "I don't know how you stay so calm." "People don't need more pressure," she said. "They need to feel like someone is in control." That made sense to him. A lot of sense. Firm steps echoed behind them. "Victoria, those numbers are still wrong." The air shifted instantly. John's expression tightened. "We already handled that." "No," she replied in the same firm tone. "You just changed how they look." Isabella tilted her head with interest. "Can you explain that a little more?" Victoria ignored the question. "If that projection is wrong," she said, looking directly at John, "you won't catch it now. One step forward. You'll catch it when it's already too late." Silence. For a second, John thought. But it passed too fast to change anything. "We just walked out of a meeting where everything was validated." "It was validated visually," she corrected. Isabella let out a small, almost imperceptible laugh. "I hear you," she said, "but sometimes we need to trust the whole picture, not just one detail." Victoria finally looked at her, and in that moment there was something there. Not confrontation. Recognition. "That is not a detail," she said. Then she turned back to John. "Empires don't fall from lack of money." A short pause. "They fall from arrogance." The hallway went quiet. John locked his jaw. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Victoria held his gaze for a second, then nodded. "I hope so." And she left, without looking back. The sound of her footsteps faded away. John let out a breath, unsettled. "Was she always like that?" Isabella smiled lightly. "Direct? Yes. Exhausting." She tilted her head. "People like that tend to see things others don't. Or they create problems where there aren't any." Isabella didn't answer. She just kept her smile. But this time, something was different. Later, the office was almost empty, lights off, silent hallways. Isabella was alone, sitting. Laptop open. On the screen, no spreadsheet, no report, tab after tab. Women who started from nothing and took over major companies. Influence strategies in corporate environments. Real stories of quiet rises to power. She scrolled slowly. No rush. She stopped on an article. She read it carefully, and then she smiled, without hiding it. That's when she heard footsteps coming closer. She closed everything fast and opened a spreadsheet. By the time John appeared at the door, she was already typing. "Still here?" Just wrapping up a few things. You never stop, do you? She looked at him. Someone has to keep everything running. He laughed. Good thing I have you. She held his gaze for a second. Good thing indeed. John left. The door closed. The silence came back. Isabella stopped typing. She looked at the screen, then at her own reflection in the glass. Calm, precise, in control. And for the first time that day, it wasn't a question anymore. It was a beginning. Because while everyone was celebrating what looked like a victory, no one noticed that something had already started to shift. And the most dangerous part of all was that he trusted exactly the person he never would have imagined. The one who never left anything to chance. That night, John Caldwell slept very well. The problem is that some people don't wait for you to wake up before they start working. Victoria Sterling was exactly that kind of person. Before we go on, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. John arrived at 8:12 in the morning, coffee in hand, with the unshaken confidence of someone who came out on top the day before. He opened the laptop, checked the inbox. 3 emails from Victoria, sent at 11 at night, midnight, and 1 in the morning. In that order. He stared at those 3 emails with the look of someone who just found a parking ticket on their windshield on a beautiful sunny day. He could open them, read them, think about it, or he could take another sip of coffee and deal with it later. John took another sip of coffee. Isabella appeared at the door with that perfect timing she always had, like she knew exactly when to walk into a room. Not too early, not too late. She sent another one at 2 in the morning, said Isabella, as casually as if she were talking about the weather. I caught it through the notification system. You read her emails? I read anything that could affect your schedule. She placed a second mug on the table. That's my job. John looked at the mug, then at the emails, then back at the mug. He chose the mug. That was John Caldwell's pattern. When there were 2 paths, he always took the more comfortable one, every single time, with a consistency that was almost impressive. On the wall behind his desk, between 2 charts of quarterly goals, there was a framed photograph. A white-haired woman, thin glasses, the smile of someone who has seen it all and stopped being surprised by anything. His grandmother. She had been there for years. John rarely looked at her. That morning, he didn't look either. At 9 o'clock sharp, Victoria didn't knock. She was just there, all of a sudden, folder in hand, with that posture that made any room feel 3 degrees colder. The numbers in the expansion report are wrong. John didn't even look up. Good morning, Victoria. Good morning. A pause of exactly 1 second. The numbers are wrong. He closed the laptop, looked at her, tried to stay calm, but there was something about the way Victoria walked into a room. No hurry, no apology, no small talk. That made it impossible to pretend the issue could wait. I reviewed that report personally. I know. She opened the folder on the table with a precise movement. The projection was based on market data from 3 years ago. Not the current market. The difference is 6% in second quarter growth. Silence. John looked at the numbers. They made sense. He didn't want them to, but they did. If the investors receive this before a correction, Victoria continued, we're going to have a much bigger problem than a tense meeting. I got the point. Then let's fix it before. Victoria. She stopped. I said I got it. There was something in John's tone that wasn't anger. It was something worse. It was the tone of someone who understood but didn't want to deal with it right now. Or maybe ever. Victoria held his gaze for 2 seconds. That was exactly when Isabella walked in. She read the room in less time than it takes to blink. She glanced at the open folder, at John with his jaw slightly locked, at Victoria standing perfectly still like a verdict. And she smiled. Can I jump in for a second? Rhetorical question. She already had. Of course, said John with a relief he didn't even realize he felt. I heard the issue with the report, said Isabella, as naturally as if she were commenting on a rain forecast. It's a targeted fix. The overall structure is still solid. We update the base, adjust the numbers, and deliver a revised version before any formal meeting. Victoria looked at her. Changing the base changes the final numbers. By 6%, Isabella confirmed, which is manageable. It was already presented informally yesterday. For people who haven't signed anything yet. The two looked at each other. That silence had texture. It was the kind of silence that happens when two very smart people recognize each other and neither one likes what they see. Isabella broke it first with her usual smile. Sometimes the most important thing isn't the number itself, but how you present the correction. Transparency becomes a positive when it's communicated well. Victoria didn't respond. She looked at John. There's one more thing. She turned a page in the folder. The board mentioned last week that there's still an unidentified shareholder holding 35% of the original shares. Never showed up at any formal meeting. This needs to be addressed before the next round of strategic decisions. John frowned. That goes back to before my time. They never showed up, never interfered. I don't even know who it is. Victoria said nothing. She stood looking at him for a moment. Then she closed the folder, picked up the documents, and left. The door closed with a soft click. Victoria Sterling never slammed doors. Never. As if she knew that silence bothers people far more. John let out a slow breath. Was she always like that? Isabella tilted her head, thinking it over. Direct? Always. Exhausting. People like that tend to see things others don't. John looked at her. Or they create problems where there aren't any. Isabella didn't answer. She just kept her smile. And there it was again, the pattern. The comfortable option on one side, the uncomfortable truth on the other. John didn't need to think long. The revised report came in at 11:40, Isabella's version. Clean, clear, well put together. Adjusted numbers, the central argument intact. Everything laid out to make it easy to say yes. John read it in 6 minutes, approved it in 7. In the desk drawer, there was a folder, the same one Victoria had brought that morning. Either she forgot it when she left, or she left it on purpose. John couldn't tell. It was open to the page he hadn't read all the way through. He closed the drawer. The office cleared out like it always did. Interns first, then the analysts, then everyone else. John stayed. He always did. He opened Victoria's emails, read the second one, then the third, all the way to the end this time. It was detailed, careful. There was one line at the end that he read twice. This isn't about being right, it's about what happens when no one catches the mistake in time. He stared at that sentence for a moment. Then he opened Isabella's report. And once again he chose the easier path. Not because he was stupid. John Caldwell was never stupid. He chose because he was human. And humans, when they have both options right in front of them, tend to grab the one that doesn't hurt. The next morning. Victoria wasn't in the office. Nobody asked where she was. Nobody said a word. Nobody noticed. The 9 o'clock meeting happened without her. Lunch passed. The whole afternoon. It wasn't until 5 o'clock, when John walked past her office and saw the empty chair and the lights off, that something small, almost insignificant, crossed his mind. She had tried to warn him. 3 times, in the middle of the night. He shook his head and left. But that night, while reviewing the numbers he had approved that morning, John Caldwell found something that shouldn't have been there. A mistake, small, but the kind that grows. The mistake John had found the night before was small. Small enough to ignore. Small enough to convince himself it was nothing. And that was exactly what he did. Isabella was already in the office when John arrived. She always was. It was the kind of thing that, at first, looked like dedication. Over time, John simply stopped noticing. The way you stop noticing the air conditioning until the day it breaks. Good morning. She placed the coffee on his desk without being asked. You have the call with Marcus at 9, the internal check-in right after, and Henderson wants to move up the contract review to this afternoon if you have room. I do. Already confirmed. She opened the tablet. I also reorganized the meeting agenda. There were 3 items that overlapped. Cleaned it up. John looked at her for a second. When did you do that? This morning. What time did you get here? Isabella smiled lightly. Early enough. John shook his head with the look of someone who just won the lottery and hasn't quite processed it yet. What would I do without you? She didn't answer. She just turned the tablet toward him and pointed to the first item on the agenda. The call with Marcus went well. Better than well. It ended with Marcus using the word impressive twice in a row, which for Marcus was the emotional equivalent of a standing ovation. John walked out of the glass room with that specific lightness of someone who just confirmed what they already believed. Victoria was leaning against the hallway wall, folder in hand, waiting. He slowed down. I just need 5 minutes, she said. I have a meeting right after. A pause. 5 minutes, she repeated without moving a muscle. He opened the office door. Victoria walked in. She placed the folder on the table with that precise movement John already knew. It wasn't routine, it was intention. The Henderson contract. She opened it to the second page. There's an automatic adjustment clause tied to an index we stopped using back in 2019. If you sign it as is, the company gets locked into an outdated calculation for 3 years. John looked at the section she was pointing to. Isabella reviewed that contract. I know. She didn't mention this. I know. The silence lasted exactly long enough to be uncomfortable. It might have been a detail that slipped through, said John, more to himself than to her. Victoria didn't disagree. She just looked at him with that expression that wasn't judgment. It was something harder to deal with. It was patience. This needs to be fixed before the signing, she said. I'll go over it with Isabella before the afternoon meeting. Victoria closed the folder, took a breath, and it was exactly then that Isabella appeared at the door, 2 documents in hand, with that timing that always seemed natural but was never a coincidence. Oh, she said, glancing at both of them. Are you going over the Henderson? Victoria found an issue with the adjustment clause, said John. Isabella took the folder, flipped through it quickly, stopped at the page. 3 seconds of silence. You're right, she said to Victoria. I should have caught that earlier. Victoria looked at her. Isabella held her gaze. Steady. No need to over-explain. Corrected version before 2 o'clock. Good, said Victoria, and she left. John stood staring at the closed door. She could have said good work. Isabella gave a small smile. That's not her style. Later, in the hallway, Isabella walked alongside John with the tablet in hand. The expansion report for the Western Division is ready for your approval. We need it by tomorrow morning to send to the board. Send it now. It's already in your inbox. John opened the email on his phone, scrolled through the document, looked over the charts, the numbers, the executive summary Isabella had put together with her usual clarity. Looks solid. It is solid, she confirmed. He signed it digitally. Right there in the hallway, in 32 seconds. Neither of them noticed that Victoria was standing on the other side of the floor, in front of the coffee station, holding a cup she hadn't touched, watching the whole thing in silence. She saw John pocket his phone, saw Isabella check the signing notification, saw the brief smile Isabella didn't show John. Only the screen. Victoria took a sip of coffee. Cold, and walked away without a word. The Henderson contract was signed with Victoria's correction included. Isabella delivered the revised version 2 minutes before the deadline, with a footnote thanking the team for the observation, without naming Victoria. John didn't notice. Victoria read the note, closed the document, and opened the notebook she always carried, not to write, just to look at a line already there, written weeks ago, in firm, unhurried handwriting. She doesn't make mistakes. She leaves room to be corrected. The office emptied out. Isabella stayed. She always stayed. But this time, when the last hallway light went off and the night guard's footsteps faded into the back of the building, she closed the open spreadsheets and opened another browser. No rush, no hiding. There was no one left to see. She scrolled slowly, tab after tab. From assistant to CEO, real stories. Women who married billionaires. Power strategies in corporate transitions. She read the second article carefully. Stopped at one section, read it again, and smiled. Not the smile she wore during the day, that easy, comfortable smile that put entire rooms at ease. This was different, quieter, more real. Footsteps in the hallway. She closed everything, opened a spreadsheet, started typing before the door could open. It was just the security guard making his rounds. He walked past without looking up. Isabella waited for the footsteps to fade. Then she stopped typing. She sat looking at her own reflection in the dark glass of the window. Outside, the city blinked. Inside, everything seemed under control. And it was. Just not the kind of control John thought it was. The following morning, the board received the expansion report. Approved. Unanimous, with compliments on the clarity of the presentation. John got congratulated in 3 separate emails. He replied to all 3. None of them were from Victoria. And it was only when he opened the full inbox, already at the end of the day, that he noticed. Victoria hadn't sent a single message all week. Not one. for the first time he could remember. He stared at her absence in the inbox for a few seconds, like someone who realizes that a chair that kept getting in the way has been removed and strangely misses bumping into it. He closed the laptop, left, but that empty chair stayed with him, taking up a space he didn't quite know how to name. Empires don't collapse all at once. They crack from the inside slowly, while everyone is still applauding the outside. And the problem is that a quiet crack looks, for a good long while, exactly like stability. The first sign came in an email. Not from a major investor, not from a strategic partner. It came from Raymond Colt, a man John described as difficult, which in practice meant someone who read contracts to the very end and asked questions nobody wanted to answer. The email had 3 lines. The second quarter numbers don't match what was presented in March. I need an explanation before any future decisions. RC. John read it twice, then forwarded it to Isabella. Can you handle this? The reply came in 4 minutes. Already putting together a clarification note. Don't worry about it. John closed the laptop. Didn't worry about it. The problem was that Raymond Colt wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, 2 more investors asked similar questions. Worded differently, different tones. One more polite, one more blunt, but all pointing to the same place. The numbers didn't add up. Isabella responded to all of them with the same calm as always. Clarification notes, context adjustments, market comparisons. Each response was good enough to push the conversation down the road. Never good enough to close it. John started noticing the pattern, not in the numbers but in the responses. Every solution created a new question. Every explanation needed another explanation, but Isabella always had the next one ready. And somehow, that kept looking like competence. Victoria showed up at his door one afternoon when the office was quieter than it should have been. No folder, no documents, just her, standing at the entrance with that expression John had learned to recognize. Not anger, not judgment. The face of someone about to say something the other person doesn't want to hear. The investors are right, she said. John leaned back in his chair. I know there are questions. They're not questions. She walked in, closed the door behind her. The second quarter numbers were built on top of the expansion projection you approved in the hallway in 30 seconds. Silence. That report was reviewed, said John. It was organized. Victoria paused. Those are 2 different things. John opened his mouth, closed it, because there was something in that he recognized, the same feeling as that small mistake he had found weeks ago and chosen to ignore, that thing that grows. What are you suggesting? That we sit down with the investors? No clarification note? No go-between? Victoria looked him straight in the eye. That you show up and explain personally what happened. That's going to cause more alarm than there already is. That's going to build trust. She stepped forward. John, being upfront now costs a whole lot less than being found out later. The door opened. Isabella walked in with 2 coffees, a tablet, and her usual timing. Hey. She looked at both of them, read the room in under a second. Am I interrupting? No, said John. Victoria said nothing. Isabella set the coffee on the table, turned the tablet toward John. Just finished the response for Colt. I think it works. She slid the document toward him. It's direct. It frames the inconsistency as a normal projection adjustment, and it shifts the focus to the third quarter. I'd use the same tone with everyone else too. John read it. It was good. It was clear. It was exactly the kind of writing that made a problem look smaller than it was. He looked at Victoria, then at the document, then at Victoria again, and Victoria saw the exact moment he made his decision. It wasn't a loud decision, no argument, no confrontation, just a man looking at 2 paths and choosing once again the one that didn't hurt. Let's go with that tone, he said. Victoria stood still for a second. Then she picked up the coffee Isabella had left on the table. Took a sip, put it back down. All right, she said, and left, nothing more. John stood looking at the closed door. She'll be fine, said Isabella, lightly. I know. But neither of them sounded like they meant it. 3 days later, John received a memo from the legal department. Formal language, careful structure, the kind of document that looks neutral but never is. In short, Victoria Sterling had been reassigned. No defined project, no return date. Restricted access to the central financial system for the duration of the internal audit. John read the memo once, then called the legal department. Who filed this? It was an internal request, Mr. Caldwell. Filed yesterday afternoon. From whom? A small pause on the other end. From the executive assistant, Isabella Carter. John went quiet, hung up, sat looking at the phone for a few seconds, like someone who just heard a wrong note in a song they know by heart but can't quite place where. Then he picked up the memo, put it in the drawer, and closed it. Isabella appeared at the door. Did you see the legal department's document? I did. It's temporary. She walked in, arms lightly crossed, with the posture of someone being perfectly reasonable. With the audit underway, it makes sense to limit access to people not directly involved in the process. Standard protocol. Victoria has been with this company longer than anyone here. I know. Isabella tilted her head. And that's exactly why the audit needs to be clean. No interference, even if it's well-meaning. John looked at her. Isabella held his gaze with that calm he had come to associate with competence. That makes sense, he said finally. She nodded. Great. She turned to leave. Oh, Colt responded. He accepted the clarification. For now. For now. That's enough for the moment. She left. John sat alone. For now echoed in the room longer than it should have. That night, Victoria's office was dark. Not dark the way it gets at the end of a workday. Dark the way it gets when someone leaves early and doesn't come back. John walked past, saw the closed door, the lights off, the chair visible through the glass. He stopped, thought about knocking. Didn't knock, kept walking. And it was only when he reached the elevator, waiting for the doors to close, that something small, almost too small to notice, crossed his mind. Victoria had never filed anything against anyone. In all the years she'd been with the company, everything she'd seen, disagreed with, pushed back on, never. The elevator doors closed, and John left with that question sitting in his chest, too big to ignore, too small to act on. The kind of doubt that doesn't go away. It just grows. There's a kind of silence that isn't the absence of noise. It's the absence of movement. It's the silence of when things have already broken, and nobody has noticed yet that the floor is gone. The first contract was lost on a Monday morning. No dramatic meeting, no confrontation. It arrived as a formal email, polite language, 3 paragraphs that said, essentially, "No thank you, we're going in a different direction." John read it standing by the window, coffee still warm in his hand. He forwarded it to Isabella. She replied in 2 minutes. Looking into it might be reversible. It wasn't. The second contract came on Wednesday, the third the following week. Each one arrived the same way, polite, final, no room to negotiate. And every time John forwarded it to Isabella, the response came fast, organized, with an explanation that sounded reasonable. Market cycle, strategic realignment, adjustment period. Words that meant a lot and nothing at the same time. John started to notice he was repeating those phrases in meetings, not because he believed them, but because they were the only ones he had. Raymond Colt called one afternoon. No email this time. He called. John answered in his closed office without Isabella in the room for the first time in weeks. "I need real answers," said Colt. No preamble. Not clarification notes. Not adjusted projections. Real numbers, real sources, real explanations. "We're working on it." "John." A pause. "I've known you for 8 years, and I've never heard you sound like a press release before." Silence. "Call me when it's you again?" Colt hung up. John sat looking at the phone. Thought about calling Victoria. Opened his contacts. Held his thumb over her name for a few seconds. Closed his phone. Isabella walked in without knocking. A habit that had crept in so gradually that John couldn't even remember when it had started. "Did Colt call?" she asked, as casually as anything. He called. "I know." She sat down in the chair across from his desk, folded her hands. "I caught part of the conversation from the hallway. Sorry about that." John looked at her. He wants real answers. Everyone wants real answers when things get hard. She tilted her head. "The question is what you mean by real." "I mean the truth." Isabella was quiet for a moment. "The truth right now will cost more than waiting." She spoke calmly, no urgency. "If we come clean before we have a solution, it looks like we've lost control. If we wait until we have something solid to present, it looks like responsible crisis management. They're the same thing. They're not." She opened the tablet. One drives investors away, the other keeps them at the table. John looked at the screen she was showing him. The numbers were organized, clear. laid out in a way that made the situation look manageable. He knew it wasn't, but it looked that way. And in that moment, looking was enough. The following week was the worst the company had ever had. 2 investors formally pulled out. A third requested an independent external audit, which, in corporate terms, meant, "I don't trust what you're showing me." John spent 3 days in meetings that resolved nothing, answering questions with responses Isabella prepared between sessions, feeling for the first time in his life like he was reading lines from a script he hadn't written. One of those nights, he stayed late alone. He opened the drawer where he'd put the legal memo, the one that reassigned Victoria. Read it again. Internal request. Isabella Carter. He stared at the name for a while, then closed the drawer. It was on a quiet morning, no meetings on the calendar, that John noticed something he should have noticed a long time ago. Isabella was resolving things he hadn't asked her to resolve. It wasn't new. She had always anticipated needs. Always had the answer before the question. That was exactly what he had called talent. But now something was different. She wasn't just anticipating. She was deciding. Contracts renegotiated without his knowledge. Communications sent in his name before he'd reviewed them. Meetings canceled with reasons he had never given. Small things, each one defensible on its own. Together they formed a pattern he took too long to see. "Who approved the renegotiation with Mercer?" he asked, standing at her office door. Isabella looked up from her laptop. "You were in a meeting. It was urgent. I don't sign off on contracts without reading them." "I know." She didn't flinch, didn't rush. "But the deadline was that afternoon. And I know your standards better than anyone. I did what you would have done. That's not the same as me doing it." She was quiet for a moment. "You're right." She turned the laptop toward him. "Do you want to go over it now?" John looked at the screen. The terms were reasonable. Probably what he would have approved. "Next time you tell me first." Of course. He went back to his office, and Isabella stared at the screen for a few seconds before closing the laptop. No expression. No smile. Just herself and the silence and something that didn't need a name to exist. Victoria didn't come back to the office that week, or the next. Her extension disappeared from the internal directory. Her chair was still there, visible through the glass. But the room had that specific feeling of a place that was cleared out too fast, a cup still on the desk, a notebook forgotten in the half-open drawer. Nobody said anything. Nobody asked. And that absence of questions bothered John more than anything else. Not the empty chair, not the missing extension. The fact that no one in the company had stopped to ask where Victoria Sterling was, like she had simply never existed. The board met on a Thursday. Short, tense. The kind of meeting everyone just wants to get through. In the end, 3 resolutions passed. Immediate budget restrictions, no new contracts until the audit was complete, and a 4th seat on the executive board. New, created right there in that meeting, assigned to executive assistant Isabella Carter, in recognition of her leadership during the crisis. John voted yes. Not because he wanted to, because it was the only thing that seemed to make sense in that moment, and he had learned, over the past few months, to trust what seemed to make sense. Walking out, he passed through the glass hallway where, months earlier, Victoria had said those words. "Empires don't fall from lack of money, they fall from arrogance." He had locked his jaw that day. Now, standing in that same hallway, the same city below him, John Caldwell felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear. It was the slow, heavy, silent recognition that someone had tried to warn him. And he had chosen the coffee. That night, Isabella stayed alone in the office that used to be John's. Not her office, his. She'd stayed to organize documents for the next morning's meeting. That was what she told him when he left. But the documents were already organized. She stayed because she could. Sitting in John's chair, with the entire city lit up below, Isabella Carter looked around with the calm of someone who recognizes a place that was always supposed to be hers. And for the first time since she'd arrived at that company, she didn't close anything when she heard footsteps in the hallway. There was nothing left to hide. There's a difference between someone who takes control and someone who reveals they always had it. Isabella Carter didn't take anything. She simply stopped pretending it wasn't hers. The transition was quiet, no formal announcement beyond the board memo. No speech, no celebration, no moment where someone raises a glass and says something about new beginnings. Isabella just started showing up in places where she used to follow John. In investor meetings, she sat at the head of the table. On calls with outside partners, she was the one who spoke first. In the hallways, people paused when she walked by. Not out of respect yet, but out of that instinctive hesitation of someone who no longer knows where the hierarchy stands. And Isabella let that hesitation last just long enough for the answer to become clear. John still came to the office. Nobody had told him he couldn't. He still had an office, still had a title on paper, still got the automated good morning emails with the weather forecast. But something was different in the way people looked at him now. It wasn't disrespect, it was worse. It was that specific kind of gentleness people have when they don't know what to say to someone who's lost something. The receptionist smiled a second too long. The analyst in the hallway looked away a little too fast. The new assistant, hired by Isabella the week before, asked on the very first morning, with all the good intentions in the world, "Does Mr. Caldwell need anything, Mr. Caldwell?" John looked at her for a moment. "No, thank you." And he went to the office that was still his, closed the door, and sat in silence for a few minutes before opening the laptop. Isabella showed up late in the morning, without knocking. The habit had stayed, but the meaning had completely changed. Before it was familiarity. Now it was something else. "Meeting with the Harrington Group this afternoon," she said, standing in the doorway, tablet in hand. "I'm handling it. Just wanted you to know." "I could go." She tilted her head. "You could." A small pause. "But I think it would be confusing for them right now. With everything in transition, confusing for them." John nodded. Isabella left, and the door stayed half open. Not all the way closed, not all the way open. Right in the middle, like a detail that seemed unimportant and wasn't. Later, alone, John opened the bottom desk drawer. There was a folder in there he had never gone through. The kind of thing that piles up over the years, documents someone drops in with every intention of reviewing later and never does. He started flipping through it with no particular goal. Old contracts, meeting minutes from the company's first year, a printed photo from when the office was just 3 desks on a rented floor. He stopped at the photo for a moment, kept flipping, found a list. Company letterhead from before they'd locked in their final branding. The logo was slightly different. The footer showed an address that no longer existed. It was the original investor list, 12 names, amounts next to each one, ownership percentages. He ran his finger down the list, recognizing some names, drawing blanks on others. Stopped near the bottom. Shareholder, 35% confidential, no name, no contact, nothing beyond the percentage, and that one word in parentheses, confidential. John stared at the line. 35%. In the company's earliest months, when nobody believed in the project, when every investor meeting ended with a polite no, someone had put in 35%, no fanfare, no credit, never once spoke up in any meeting. He held the paper for a few seconds, then put it back in the folder, closed the drawer, and opened his email. There was a message from Raymond Colt. Short, without the sharp edge of the earlier ones. "I heard things have changed over there. When you're ready for a real conversation, give me a call. The door's still open. RC." John read it twice. He sat on the phrase "when you're ready for a real conversation" longer than the rest. Didn't reply, but didn't close the email either. Later in the hallway, he walked past the office that used to be Victoria's. The door was open now. Someone was in there. One of the new analysts hired in recent weeks, reorganizing the drawers with the uncomfortable efficiency of someone settling into a space that belonged to someone else. The cup was gone from the desk, the notebook too. John stopped at the entrance for a second. The analyst looked up. "Can I help you?" "No." John stepped back. "Sorry." He kept walking. And it was only when he reached the window at the end of the hall, the same window where Victoria had stood holding her cold coffee, watching Isabella in the corridor, that something clicked in a way he couldn't shake. Victoria had seen something in that hallway. Not once, many times. And every time she had tried to say what she saw, he had gone with the more comfortable version. Not because he was stupid. Because it was easier. Isabella was in the conference room when he walked by. Door open. On the phone, back to the entrance, looking out at the city, exactly the way John used to stand when things were simple. He stopped without meaning to. She was speaking low. He couldn't make out the words, only the tone. Calm, steady, with that specific rhythm of someone who knows exactly what effect each word is going to have. It was the same tone she had used with him for months. And standing there in the hallway, looking at her reflection in the window glass, John Caldwell understood something that had been right in front of him the whole time. Isabella hadn't changed. He had just stopped being the one she was talking to. She hung up, stood looking at the city for a second, then turned around and saw John standing at the entrance. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she smiled. It wasn't the smile from before. It looked similar, same muscles, same lightness, but something was missing. John couldn't name what. "Do you need something?" she asked. "No," he stepped back, "just passing through." She nodded, went back to the table, and John walked away down the hallway with that phrase from Colt still sitting in the back of his mind. When you're ready for a real conversation, maybe it was time for that. A real conversation, except the person he needed to talk to wasn't there anymore. And he had no idea where to find her. Finding someone you ignored is easy. The hard part is showing up at their door and discovering they're doing just fine, that they built something, that they weren't waiting for you. It took John 4 days to find the bakery. Not because it was hard to find. It was halfway down the block on Clement Street, a hand-painted wooden sign out front, a line that started before 8 in the morning. It took 4 days because every time he got close, something stopped his feet just short of the door. Pride, probably. The kind of pride that has nothing left to protect but still makes noise out of habit. On the 5th morning, he walked in. The place was smaller than it looked from outside. 6 tables, wooden chairs that didn't match. The smell of butter and coffee mixed with something he couldn't quite place. Cinnamon, maybe? Or vanilla? Or just the smell of a place where everything was made from scratch every single morning. There was a line at the counter. 3 people ahead of him, each one knowing exactly what they wanted, ordering by name like people who did this every day. John stood looking at the menu written on a chalkboard behind the counter. Uneven handwriting, no decimal points, a list that changed depending on the day. Nobody was behind the counter at that moment. Then the kitchen door opened. Victoria came out carrying a tray of bread that was still steaming. She set it on the counter with the same precise movement she used to place folders on meeting tables, and looked up. She saw John. Went completely still for exactly 1 second, then went back to arranging the bread. "Line starts over there," she said, pointing without looking. John got in line. When his turn came, Victoria was in an apron, hair tied back, a small flour stain on her right wrist she hadn't noticed. He had never seen her with flour on her wrist. "What can I get you?" she asked in her usual tone. Direct, no small talk, none of that uncomfortable gentleness everyone had been using with him for weeks. It was strangely a relief. "Coffee," he said, and he looked at the board. "What's the morning loaf?" "Banana walnut bread, baked today." "I'll take it," she wrote it down. Turned to the coffee machine. "Aren't you going to ask what I'm doing here?" said John. "I know what you're doing here." She placed the cup under the machine nozzle. "The company fell apart, you lost control, and now you're at the bakery of someone who tried to warn you." A pause. "The coffee is $3.50. The bread is $2.75. John put the money on the counter. Victoria handed him the cup and the bread wrapped in craft paper. "Table in the back is open." He went. Sat alone for a while, looking at the coffee, the bread, the flow of the bakery. A steady stream of people who walked in knowing what they wanted and left with what they needed. Simple as that. Victoria moved between the counter and the kitchen with that economy of movement he had learned to recognize as efficiency. Nothing wasted, nothing beyond what was needed. When the rush slowed down, she poured a coffee for herself and sat at the table next to his. Not the same table, the one next to it. John noticed. "Did you open this place?" he asked. "Bought it from a woman who wanted to retire." Victoria took a sip. 6 months ago. 6 months. He did the math. "You already knew you were leaving." She didn't confirm, didn't deny. "I knew something was going to change." She looked at the table, not at him. It always becomes clear when a situation can't be fixed anymore. The silence lasted a few seconds. I didn't come here to apologize, said John. Victoria looked up. I know. But I should. She looked at him for a moment, not with judgment, not with satisfaction. With that patience he had called coldness for months, and which now, without the wrong context, felt like something else entirely. What did you come here for, John? He set his cup on the table. I don't know. A pause. To start something over, I think. Anything. Somewhere that still makes sense. Victoria looked at him for long enough to be uncomfortable. Then she stood up. Do you know how to do anything with your hands? John blinked. What do you mean? Cook, fix things, lift something heavy, anything practical. She picked up her cup. That isn't a meeting or a presentation. He actually thought about it. I can make an omelet. Victoria was quiet for 3 seconds. Everyone can make an omelet. Mine is really good. Everyone thinks their own omelet is really good. John opened his mouth, closed it. It was the first conversation in weeks that hadn't been about a crisis or protocol or managing appearances. Just him and a woman with flour on her wrist arguing about omelets in an empty bakery. And for some reason, that was exactly what he needed. Do you have any openings? He said. Victoria looked him up and down with the objectivity of someone assessing something without a trace of sentiment. You were already late today. The line was long. The line was normal. You were late. I didn't know the hours. 6:30 in the morning, every day. She turned toward the counter. No suit? John looked at what he was wearing. This isn't a suit. Those are designer pants that cost more than my commercial blender. They won't work here. She went to the kitchen. The door swung lightly behind her. John stood looking at it for a moment. Then, without overthinking it, he walked up to the counter and called toward the half-open door. I'll be here tomorrow at 6:30. Silence from the kitchen. Then Victoria's voice. No warmth, no coldness either. Don't be late. He walked out along Clement Street, empty coffee cup in hand, the crumpled bread wrapper stuffed in his pocket. The city moved at its usual pace, loud, indifferent, completely unaware that a man who had run a $100 million company had just asked for a job at a 6-table bakery. And the strangest part, he walked out of there feeling lighter than he had felt walking into any meeting in the past 2 years. There was something in it he couldn't quite name yet. Not hope, not relief. Something simpler than that. The feeling that, for the first time in a long time, nobody had pretended that things were fine. That night, in a city that never slept, Isabella Carter signed her first document as an executive board member of Caldwell Corp. Pen on paper, her name where his used to be. She stared at the signature for a moment, then closed the folder and opened the laptop. This time there was nothing to hide. The search was right there, open, no disguise. Hostile shareholder acquisition, minority to majority transition. How to identify anonymous shareholders. She scrolled slowly, and the smile that appeared wasn't the meeting smile. It was the other one, the real one. There is a humility you choose, and there is a humility that life chooses for you. John Caldwell showed up at 6:28 in the morning, jeans, sneakers, and the expression of someone who had spent all night practicing how to look like they didn't care. Victoria opened the door without commenting on the time. Just looked at his feet. Those sneakers cost $300. $280. Same thing. She walked in. You'll destroy them in a week. I have others. Great. Where are the others? She went to the kitchen. He followed. The bakery kitchen was smaller than the bathroom of the office John had worked in for 6 years. 2 stainless steel counters, an industrial oven, shelves from floor to ceiling packed with flours and sugars and hand-labeled containers and handwriting he recognized immediately as Victoria's. Precise. No frills. Start by wiping down the counters, she said, not looking up. Cloth is on the 3rd hook to the left. Cleaner is under the sink. Warm water, not hot. John found the cloth, found the cleaner, turned on the faucet. Warm, repeated Victoria, without turning around. He adjusted the temperature. He wiped down the first counter with the exaggerated care of someone trying to prove they know how to do something they have clearly never done in their life. Victoria walked past, looked at the counter, and pointed to a corner. There. He wiped there. And there. He wiped there too. Good. She picked up a bowl. Now you're going to weigh the flour. I know how to weigh flour. She placed the bowl on the scale and looked at him with an expression that wasn't doubt. It was scientific curiosity. 450 grams. John picked up the flour bag, poured. The scale read 530. Silence. 450, repeated Victoria. I saw. The scale saw too. He took some out. The scale read 408. He added a little more, 502. Victoria stood watching with her arms crossed and that infinite patience that, in a corporate setting, he had called coldness, and which now looked more and more like something else entirely. You overshoot, she said. Every time. You correct in the right direction, but you go too far. John stopped. Looked at the scale. It's a pattern, she said plainly. No judgment. No extra weight behind it. Just an observation. And it was exactly because it was just an observation that it stuck. The whole morning went like that. John knocked over a bowl of brown sugar. It wasn't where it was yesterday, said Victoria. It's where it is today, she replied. Always look before you grab. And spent 15 minutes sweeping sugar off the floor while she kept right on working like nothing had happened. He forgot to seal the dough before putting it in the oven, and the bread came out with a crack down the center. Victoria looked at it for 3 seconds and said only, "Good texture, shape didn't hold. Use it today, next time you seal it." He tried to decorate a croissant with a small knife, and the result was what Victoria described, with clinical precision, as emotional geometry. What does that mean? It means it looks like you were feeling a lot of things while you made it. Is that bad? In life? No. She picked up the croissant, turned it over in her hand, set it aside. In baking, depends on the day. John looked at the croissant for a moment, then he laughed. Not the polished meeting laugh, a real one, a little tired, a little relieved, the kind that comes out when you finally stop pretending you're okay and realize it's okay not to be. Victoria didn't laugh, but there was something different at the corner of her mouth. During the break, they stood outside at the small back entrance that opened onto an alley with a cement bench and a tree with no name. Victoria was drinking coffee. John was drinking water, because Victoria had said too much coffee made your hands imprecise, and he had quietly decided to take that seriously. The silence between them had shifted. It wasn't the silence of two sides of a table anymore. It was the silence of two people who didn't need to fill the space. "Why did you buy the bakery?" asked John. Victoria held the cup with both hands. "Because I knew how to do it. You knew how to do a lot of things." "Yes." She looked at the nameless tree. "But most of the things I knew how to do depended on someone wanting to listen." That landed slowly. John didn't answer right away. He'd learned over the past few weeks that some things need space before they get a response. "I should have listened," he said finally. Victoria didn't say "I know" or "yes, you should have." She didn't say anything that was about being right. She said, "You heard what you needed to hear at that moment." A pause. "Everyone does that. That's not an excuse." "No, it isn't." She took a sip. "But it's not a life sentence either." John looked at her. And for the first time since he'd known her, since the hallways, since the folders on the table, since all the things he had called inconvenient, that now sounded like the most sensible things anyone had ever said to him, he saw her whole. Not the Victoria who disrupted meetings. Not the Victoria who was always right in a way that bothered him. The Victoria who had been there before anyone else at his company, back when the company was just an idea on a rented floor and had stayed. Without asking for more space than she was given. Without giving up when people stopped listening. Without ever explaining why she stayed. "You believed in the company," he said. It wasn't a question. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I believed in what it could be. And in me?" She turned toward him. Looked at him with that directness he had spent years misreading as an attack, when it was actually respect. It was just the way she treated things that mattered. "When you stopped trying to look like you had all the answers," she said, "you were the most capable person I ever saw in a room." John went still. Because that wasn't comfort. Victoria Sterling didn't do comfort. It was an assessment. Clear, honest, no softening. And it hit him in a way no compliment ever had. He nodded, slowly, looking at the floor. "I wasted a lot of time." She didn't soften it. But wasted time and lost time aren't the same thing. She stood up, picked up her empty cup. Break's over, and went back inside. The afternoon was calmer. John found the rhythm, not a perfect rhythm, not the rhythm of someone who was born knowing, the rhythm of someone who stopped fighting the process and started following it. Victoria corrected less. Not because she was satisfied, but because he had stopped guessing and started asking. Near the end of the day, while he was wiping down the counter, this time without needing to be told, she walked past, looked at the work, and said only, "Better." 2 syllables. But in Victoria Sterling's vocabulary, better carried the weight of a full speech. John didn't respond, just kept wiping, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. That night, across the city, Victoria's phone rang. She looked at the screen. A number she didn't recognize, but the area code was from a law office she knew very well. She answered, listened, and when she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes, looking at her hands. Then she opened the drawer, took out the notebook, turned to the last written page, and added a line below all the others, in the same firm, unhurried handwriting as always. She found the trail. Faster than I expected. She closed the notebook. And for the first time since the whole thing had started, Victoria Sterling looked, just for a second, worried. There are things you only understand later. The difference between what you thought you needed and what you actually needed, for example. John Caldwell needed 1 year, 42 burned loaves, and one memorable argument about the correct temperature of butter to figure that out. The bakery had grown, not spreadsheet growth, no new investors, no funding rounds, no expansion projections laid out in colorful charts. The kind of growth that happens when a place is genuinely good and people tell other people who tell others who show up on a Tuesday morning for no particular reason and find themselves coming back on Thursday. The line now wrapped around the block by 7 in the morning. They'd hired May, 23 years old, baker's daughter, arrived before everyone and left after everyone, with the rare ability to do 4 things at once without ever looking rushed. And they had John, who, after a year, still couldn't weigh flour on the first try, but made the best walnut bread on Clement Street. Victoria had said that once in a low voice, almost to herself, thinking he hadn't heard. He heard, and held on to it like it was a trophy. The routine had the rhythm of things that work. 6:30, John opened the kitchen, turned on the oven, checked the ingredients, started the first batch. Victoria arrived at 7. Looked around with the expression of someone confirming that the universe was still in its place, and then, only then, put on her apron. They rarely talked much in the first hours. No need to. There was a language of their own that had settled in without any announcement. The way John slid the bowl toward her without being asked, the way she adjusted the oven timer a minute before he realized he'd forgotten, the way they moved through the small kitchen without ever colliding, like 2 people who had learned each other's space without ever trying to. May had noticed this in the first week and said, with the bluntness of someone with no filter, "You 2 look like you've been married for 20 years and nobody told either of you." Victoria had replied, "Focus on the croissants." John had turned red in a way that May found deeply informative. On an October morning, with the wind starting to shift and the smell of cinnamon drifting down the block, John was decorating a pie when the dough cutter slipped. The pie survived. The counter did not. "You do that on purpose," said Victoria, appearing with a cloth before he even asked. "I don't do it on purpose. Every week. It's a statistical coincidence. That is not what statistics means. I know what statistics means." "Then you know that 4 times in 52 weeks isn't a coincidence." She wiped the counter with that precision he had stopped finding irritating and started finding, if he was being honest, genuinely reassuring. "It's a pattern. You and your patterns. Patterns exist whether you like them or not." John looked at her with his arms crossed. "Do you ever lose an argument?" Victoria thought for a second. "Not that I can remember." Check. And she walked back to the oven, with the cloth folded over her shoulder, perfectly serious, leaving John alone with the surviving pie. And that feeling, which had become so familiar, he barely noticed it anymore, that the day was exactly the way it needed to be. Lunchtime was when the bakery got its quietest. The morning rush had passed, the afternoon one hadn't started yet. There was that 40-minute window where the place belonged just to them. They ate lunch on the cement bench out back, with the containers Victoria had made the night before, Simple, no ceremony, different every day, because she said eating the same thing every week was the emotional equivalent of giving up. That afternoon, John was eating and looking at the nameless tree when he said, without planning it, "I don't miss it." Victoria didn't ask what. She knew. "Nothing at all?" she said, "just to confirm." "The meetings, no." He paused. "The sense of direction, maybe. That feeling of working toward something. You work toward something every day. Bread isn't the same thing." Victoria looked at him. "Why not?" John opened his mouth, closed it, because honestly, he didn't have a good answer for that. He had spent his whole life believing that the scale of the goal was what determined its value, that the bigger the number, the more real the achievement. And here he was, in an alley in San Francisco, flour on his forearm, a container of rice and chicken in his lap, with absolutely nothing to say to a simple question. "You're doing this on purpose," he said. "Doing what?" "Making me realize things." "I don't do anything on purpose." She went back to her food. "Things just are what they are. You just took a long time to look." John was quiet. He looked at the nameless tree. "What's it called?" "What? The tree?" Victoria looked at it like she had never thought about the question. "I don't know." "You don't know? Never looked it up?" "You." John pointed at her. "The woman who labels every single container in the kitchen with the name, the date, and the instructions, doesn't know the name of the tree in her own backyard." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Maybe some things don't need a name to be right where they belong. The wind shifted. A leaf fell. And John Caldwell looked at Victoria Sterling with that specific kind of clarity that only shows up when you stop trying to analyze and just start seeing, and realized she wasn't talking about the tree. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. But something had shifted in the silence between them. It got warmer. The afternoon ran its usual course. It was only at the end of the day, when May had already left, and the bakery was closed, and they were finishing the cleanup, that John's phone rang, Raymond Colt's number. He looked at the screen for a moment. Victoria, on the other side of the kitchen, didn't ask who it was. But she stopped cleaning. John answered. "Raymond?" "John." The voice on the other end had that quality of someone who has gone straight to the point so many times in life they can't do it any other way. "I needed to tell you personally before you heard it from somewhere else." "Tell me what?" "Part of the Caldwell Corp shareholder package is being moved. Someone is buying in, aggressively." John went still. "Isabella?" "No." A pause. "Isabella already has what she had. The one making moves is someone else. Someone who's been off the radar until now." 3 seconds of silence. "I need more details before I could—" "I know. That's why I'm calling." Colt took a breath. "There's an extraordinary board meeting in 2 weeks. If you want to be there, now's the time to decide." John hung up. He stood in the middle of the clean kitchen, phone in hand, cinnamon still in the air. Victoria was looking at him from across the counter. She had heard enough. And there was something in her expression, not surprise, never surprise, that John noticed but couldn't read. "Did you know?" he said. Victoria picked up her apron, folded it carefully, placed it on the shelf. "I know a lot of things," she said. "The question is always the right moment." And she walked out through the back door, leaving John alone with an answer that wasn't an answer, and a question that had just gotten a whole lot bigger. Because someone was making moves. And the only person who might know who it was had just walked out without saying. There is a type of person who gets older and softer. And then there is Eleanor Caldwell, who gets older and sharper. John had called his grandmother the night of Colt's call. She had listened in silence, which, for Eleanor, was the equivalent of someone else interrupting 3 times and asking to repeat. Then she had said, "Come see me tomorrow. Early." "What time?" "Before lunch. After that I get impatient." "You get impatient at any hour." "Yes, but before lunch I still pretend I don't." She hung up. Eleanor Caldwell's house was exactly what you'd expect from a woman who had built her own fortune before getting married, lost her husband without losing her footing, and raised a brilliant grandson she loved deeply and disagreed with at an impressive frequency. Large, organized by a logic that only made sense to her. Books where other people would put decorations, and decorations where other people would put books. John arrived at 10 in the morning. Eleanor was on the back porch, drinking tea, reading glasses on her nose, a folded newspaper on the chair beside her that she had clearly read cover to cover before 8. She watched him come in without taking off her glasses. "You look like someone who didn't sleep enough and thought too much." "Good morning, Grandma." "Good morning. Sit down." She pointed to the chair across from her. "Tea is on the table. I won't offer you coffee because you get worked up, and when you get worked up, you make bad decisions." "I don't get worked up. The last time you got worked up, you gave an executive seat to a woman you'd known for 8 months. Eleanor folded her glasses carefully. "Sit down." John sat down, picked up the tea, took a sip in silence, looking at the garden, well kept, simple, nothing excessive, like everything Eleanor owned. She watched him with that particular attention of someone who raised a person and knows every version that person has ever been. "Talk," she said. "Raymond Colt called me. Someone is making moves on the company's shares, aggressively. There's an extraordinary board meeting in 2 weeks. He paused. "I want to know if you know anything." Eleanor was quiet. The wind moved the leaves gently in the garden. "And what if I did?" she said, finally. "Then I'd like to talk about your 16%. Eleanor set her teacup on the table with a deliberate movement. "Ah," she tilted her head. "So that's it? You still have the shares?" "I do. And I'd like to, John." She looked at him with that firmness he had inherited from her, just in a more diluted version. "You'd like what, exactly? To use my 16% to try to take back something you lost because you weren't paying attention? I'm trying to fix a mistake." "Fix or take back?" A pause. "What's the difference?" "The difference," said Eleanor, with the patience of someone who has explained obvious things many times and explains them again anyway, "is that fixing means understanding what broke. Taking back means wanting what was yours." She picked up her cup. "And I need to know which one you're doing before I decide anything." John was quiet. It was exactly the kind of question with no quick answer. And Eleanor had raised him. She knew that. She waited. Later, inside the house, while Eleanor made more tea with the efficiency of someone who has never needed help with anything, John stood in the living room, looking at the photographs on the wall. There was one of him at 16, smiling in a way he could no longer reproduce naturally. There was one of his grandmother when she was younger, standing in front of the first office she'd ever opened, before he was born, before anything. And there was one he hadn't noticed before. Small, in a corner, slightly crooked, which was unusual because Eleanor did not tolerate crooked frames. A photograph of a meeting. Long table, several people, documents in front of each of them. John stepped closer. He recognized the room. It was the conference room from Caldwell Corp's first office. He was there, younger, with the expression of someone who didn't yet know the size of what he had started. On the left side of the table there was someone it took him a second to recognize. Victoria. Younger. Same posture as always, looking at the table, not the camera. Like she was reading something while everyone else posed for the photo. John stood looking at the picture. "When was this?" he asked out loud. Eleanor appeared at the entrance to the room, cup in hand. The company's first big deal. She walked over, looked at the photo with that calm expression of someone who holds memories without needing to announce them. "You don't remember her being there?" "I remember the deal. I don't remember her in that room." "She was in all of them." Eleanor took a sip. "You just weren't looking in that direction." John was quiet. Eleanor went back to the porch without another word. He stayed a moment longer, looking at the photograph. At the version of Victoria that existed before he truly knew she existed. On the porch, Eleanor was already sitting when he returned. There was an envelope on the table that hadn't been there before. John looked at the envelope. "What is that?" "Sit down first." He sat. Eleanor placed her cup on the table, folded her hands, and looked at him with the expression of someone about to say something they'd been carrying for a long time. "I'm going to tell you something I've held on to for years. Not because it was mine to keep. It wasn't. It belonged to someone else. But she asked me to wait for the right moment." A pause. "And I think that moment is here." John went still. "When you started the company," said Eleanor, "you needed capital. A lot of it. And nobody believed in the project. You remember that?" "I remember." "You remember how things suddenly came together. How there was suddenly enough investment to move forward when just days before it had seemed impossible. I figured it was a combination of things. Market timing. A few coincidences that... Eleanor looked at him. He stopped. It wasn't a coincidence, John. The garden went quiet around them. Eleanor spoke slowly, with the clarity of someone who chose every word ahead of time. Someone bought 35% of your company's initial capital when nobody else would put in a single cent. When the banks closed their doors, when investor after investor said no. This person came in quietly, no conditions, no demand for a board seat, no ask for recognition of any kind. John felt something shift in his chest. And stayed, Eleanor continued. All these years, holding 35% of a company that grew, that prospered, and then was lost, without ever saying a word about it to you. Oh, he said in a voice that came out lower than he meant it to. Eleanor pushed the envelope toward him. He opened it carefully. Inside was a legal document. Old paper, formal language, a date at the top that took him back to a time when the company was still just an idea on a rented floor. He followed the text down to the signature. Victoria A. Sterling, 35%. John stared at those two lines. The name he knew, the stake he had never known was hers. The date that lined up exactly with the period when everything had finally fallen into place, when he had credited luck, the market, the universe working in his favor. It hadn't been the universe, it had been her. She never said anything, he murmured. No. All those years, she worked there, she saw me every day. And never. No. John set the document on the table carefully, like something that could break. Why, he said. Why did she never say anything? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because some answers deserve the space before they're spoken. Because she didn't do it to be recognized, said Eleanor finally. She did it because she believed. In you. In what you were capable of building. A pause. And people who truly believe don't need credit to keep believing. That word landed slowly. Believed. John looked at his own hands, the same hands that signed contracts without reading them, that accepted the wrong coffee and called it efficiency, that had closed drawers on documents he didn't want to face. And now, he said in a small voice. Now, said Eleanor, I'm going to sell my 16% to her. John looked up. Grandma? No. She raised one hand, firm and gentle at the same time, the way only people with a lot of practice can be both at once. You know me. You know I don't make decisions on impulse. And you know that when I decide something, I decide it for a reason. I know. Then listen carefully. She leaned slightly toward him, glasses in hand, eyes direct. Victoria Sterling bought 35% of your company when you needed it, and nobody else showed up. She worked beside you for years without ever revealing that. She tried to warn you when there was still time to change course, and you didn't listen. Eleanor spoke without cruelty, just with the quiet precision of someone describing what they saw. With my 16%, she will have 51. Majority. Control. And I cannot think of a single person who deserves that more than she does. John was silent for a long moment. Part of him wanted to argue, wanted to say he had changed, that he had learned, that a year of bakery and flour and conversations in an alley with a nameless tree had transformed something fundamental in him. All of that was true. But truth is not currency for decisions that belong to other people. He looked at the document on the table, at Victoria's signature, at the old date. I know, he said finally. Eleanor looked at him. Are you angry? No, a long pause. I'm ashamed. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she did something she rarely did. She placed her hand over his. Gentle, no speech. That, she said softly, is different from anything you've felt before. John nodded, because it was. Anger he knew, frustration he knew, loss he had learned to know over the past year, slowly, between one burned loaf and the next. But this shame, the clean, defenseless shame of someone who finally understands the size of what they ignored, that was new. And it hurt in a way that, strangely, felt necessary, like the flour on the scale that goes too far and has to be carefully pulled back to get to the right weight. He left in the early afternoon. In the car, before turning on the engine, he sat still for a few minutes with the document folded in his pocket and that crooked photograph still in his mind. Victoria, on the left side of the table, looking at the documents while everyone else posed, always there. Always looking at what mattered, while the others looked at the camera. He started the engine. And when he turned the corner, his phone lit up with a message from Colt. The meeting was moved up to Thursday. Isabella found out the 35% shareholder is still active. She's moving fast. Very fast. John stared at the message. Isabella was looking for the anonymous shareholder. She was looking for Victoria. And she had no idea Victoria was already 3 steps ahead. But he also didn't know. And that was what kept everything open, whether 3 steps were enough. There are meetings that decide numbers. And there are meetings that decide who people really are. Thursday morning, the Caldwell Corp conference room was about to be both at the same time. Isabella arrived first. She always arrived first. It was a habit that had started as strategy and become nature. Get there early, read the room, position everything before the others walked in. She chose the seat at the head of the table, the place that had been John's, that had then been hers, that she intended to keep. The board members filed in gradually, 6 in total, each with that specific expression of someone summoned to an extraordinary meeting without fully understanding why. Isabella greeted each one with her usual ease, that smile that made people relax without noticing they had relaxed. Raymond Colt walked in, gave her a brief nod, the kind from someone who saves their words for when they count, and sat on the opposite side of the table. The company's attorney, Gerald Nash, 70 years old, completely white hair, suits that looked like they'd been bought in the same decade he passed the bar, came in next with a thick folder under his arm. Isabella looked at the folder, looked at Nash, and for a fraction of a second, just one, something crossed her face that wasn't the usual smile. It was fast. Nobody saw it, except Raymond Colt, who had spent 40 years in rooms like that one and had learned that the most important moments are always the briefest. 2 minutes before the scheduled time, the door opened. Victoria walked in, dark pants, simple top, hair tied back as always. No rush, no announcement, nothing that suggested this was any different from any other day. She swept the room with her eyes. The board members, Nash with his folder, Colt in the back, and then her gaze landed on Isabella's. The two looked at each other. No visible hostility. Not the kind of tension people around them could feel on their skin. Something more subtle, and because of that, heavier. The quiet recognition of 2 people who had been on the same board for a long time and were finally seeing each other with complete clarity. Isabella tilted her head slightly. Victoria didn't respond to the gesture. She sat 3 chairs away, opened the notebook she was carrying, and waited. Nash opened the meeting with the efficiency of someone who has run enough of them to know that a long preamble is a sign of weakness. We have called this extraordinary meeting to address a shareholder movement that directly affects the control structure of Caldwell Corp. He opened the folder. Before any vote or deliberation, the board needs to review certain documents. Isabella folded her hands on the table. I also have documents to present, she said with that professional ease that had worked for years. Regarding the identification of the anonymous shareholder holding 35% of the original shares. We have reason to believe this stake was acquired through irregular means, and that. Nash cut her off with the specific gentleness of someone who doesn't need to raise their voice to end a conversation. If you'll allow me, I'd like to present the documents in the order they were filed. A pause. Of course, said Isabella. She smiled, but it was the smile of someone recalculating. Nash placed the first document on the table and passed a copy to each board member. This is the original shareholder record of Caldwell Corp., dated from the company's first year of operation. He waited for everyone to find the right page. I want to draw the board's attention to the item identified as shareholder. 35%. Confidential. The board members looked at the document. Isabella looked at the document, and then Nash placed the second paper on the table. This is the identification document for this shareholder, held in custody by this company's law firm since the original date of investment, to be disclosed only upon a specific condition established by the shareholder herself. Nash looked at Victoria. That condition was communicated to the firm last week. Complete silence in the room. Nash continued. The shareholder holding 35% of the original shares of Caldwell Corp. Since the company's first year of operation is Victoria A. Sterling. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then someone shifted in their chair. Then another. And then everyone looked at Victoria at the same time, as if they needed to confirm she was still the same person who had been sitting there a moment before. She was. Same posture, same notebook open on the table, the same expression of someone describing what they see without needing a dramatic reaction to confirm it's real. "You were there from the very beginning," said one of the board members, more to himself than to her. "Yes," said Victoria, simply. Isabella went completely still. Not the stillness of shock, the controlled stillness of someone processing at a speed far beyond what their face can show. Her eyes moved across the document. Then Victoria, then Nash, then the document again, and then slowly she leaned back in her chair. The smile came back. Different, thinner, more real than any smile she had used in that room before. "Impressive," she said with a lightness that sounded like the echo of a word used in that same room years ago, on an afternoon when a presentation had changed its appearance but not its content. Victoria looked at her. "Third document," said Nash without pausing. "Transfer of 16% of Caldwell Corp shares from Eleanor Ruth Caldwell to Victoria A. Sterling, formalized yesterday before a notary public." He placed the paper on the table. The math was simple. 35 plus 16, 51. Nobody needed to say it out loud. Isabella was the first to speak, after a silence that had lasted long enough to feel real. "You planned this from the beginning. It wasn't an accusation, it was recognition." Victoria turned toward her. "I invested in a company I believed had a future." Pause. "And I waited. For years." "Yes," without saying a word. "That's right." Isabella tilted her head slightly, with the expression of someone sizing up something with genuine professional respect. "You are much better at this than I gave you credit for." "I know," said Victoria. And there was something in that "I know" that wasn't arrogance. Just the plain statement of someone who had waited a very long time for the truth to speak for itself, and who didn't need to add anything more. Isabella looked at her for a moment, then looked at the table, at the documents, at the board members watching the quietest duel that room had ever seen. "So," said Isabella, finally, composure fully intact, the way someone loses with the same grace they win. "I still have 49%. "You do," confirmed Victoria. "That's not nothing." "No, it isn't." The two looked at each other, and in that look there was an entire conversation neither of them needed to have out loud, about what had happened, about what each of them had done and left undone, about the games that had been played and the ones still ahead. Victoria was the first to look away. Not because she backed down, because it was done. The meeting closed with the formality that kind of meeting requires. Votes recorded, documents signed, control structure updated. Victoria Sterling, with 51%, assumed majority control of Caldwell Corp. Isabella Carter remained with 49%. As the board members filed out, exchanging glances worth weeks of hallway commentary, Nash collected the documents with the calm of someone who did what they came to do and can leave satisfied. Raymond Colt stopped beside Victoria before heading out. "Well done," he said in a low voice. She nodded. He left. In the hallway, Isabella and Victoria walked out at the same time. They moved side by side for a moment, not by choice, just by the geometry of the narrow corridor, before Isabella stopped in front of the window looking out over the city. The same window. The same hallway where, years earlier, Victoria had said something nobody had taken seriously. Isabella stood looking at the city for a moment. "You were never the problem," she said without turning around. "I just needed it to look like you were." Victoria stopped. "I know," she said. "It worked for a good while." "It did." Isabella turned toward her, not with anger, not with defeat, with that specific expression of someone who respects the opponent more than the allies. "What are you going to do with the company?" "What should have been done all along," said Victoria. "Work." Isabella was quiet for a moment. Then she gave a small smile. Not the tool smile, not the calculated one. Something smaller, more honest. "I'm keeping the 49%, she said. "I know." "That means we'll still be seeing each other." "It does." The two stood in silence for a moment, looking at the city below. Then Isabella walked away down the hallway. No rush, without looking back. And Victoria stood alone at the window, with the entire city lit up in an afternoon that had started to brighten. She opened the notebook, found the last line she had written. She found the trail. faster than I expected, and added just 2 words below it in the same firm handwriting as always. Not enough. She closed the notebook. And for the first time in years, Victoria Sterling stood still in a hallway with nowhere she needed to be. No folder in hand, no meeting waiting, nothing left that needed fixing before it was too late. Just herself. And built-in silence. While everyone else was looking the other way. There is a question most people never ask out loud, not because it's hard to answer, but because the answer requires admitting you spent a good while running in the wrong direction. John Caldwell needed 42 years, 1 company, 1 fall, and an alley with a nameless tree to get to that question, and when he got there, the answer was the last place he expected. He found out about the meeting from his phone, a message from Colt, 2 lines, direct as always. Victoria Sterling assumed 51%. Everything formalized. We were thinking of you. John read it on the porch of the small apartment he had rented the year before. No home office, no conference room, nothing that reminded him of what he used to be. Just a porch with 2 chairs and a view of the block that, on most mornings, smelled like coffee from the bakery on the corner. He stared at the message for a while, then put his phone down on the table, and went to make coffee. At the bakery that morning, everything ran its usual course. May arrived 5 minutes early with the energy of someone who slept well and has absolutely no guilt about it. Victoria opened the oven and checked the first batch with that focused expression he had learned not to interrupt. And John weighed the flour, 450 grams first try, no adjustment, and placed the bowl on the counter without saying a word. Victoria looked at the scale, then at him, said nothing. But there was something different in her silence that morning. Less held back, more present. Like an open window where before there had only been a wall. The morning rush came and went like always. The line, the orders, the smell of cinnamon taking over the block. May humming something nobody could identify, which everyone had long since stopped asking about. During the break, they went to the cement bench out back. The nameless tree was there, same as always. John sat. Victoria sat, silence. Then, I heard, he said. I figured. Colt sent a message. Victoria nodded, holding the coffee with both hands. That gesture he had learned to recognize as hers, not cold, not distant, just the way she held things that mattered. How are you? She said. John was quiet for a moment. It was a simple question, but Victoria didn't ask simple questions by accident. Good, he said finally. In a way I didn't expect to be. She looked at him. Explain. I thought it was going to hurt more. He looked at the tree, knowing the company has a new owner, that it's not me, that I should never have let it get this far. A pause. But what I feel most is relief, and that confuses me a little. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Relief isn't confusion, she said. It's clarity. He looked at her. You knew I was going to feel that? I knew that when you stopped trying to win back what you'd lost, what you actually wanted would be left standing. John kept looking at her. And what do I want? Victoria took a sip of coffee. That, she said, you already know. The wind moved the leaves of the nameless tree, and John Caldwell, for the first time in a long while, didn't try to answer faster than the question deserved. Later, after May had left and the bakery was closed and they were finishing the cleanup in silence, John stopped in the middle of the kitchen. Victoria, on the other side of the counter, noticed he had stopped. What is it? I want to ask you something. He set the cloth down on the sink, and I need you to answer me straight. Not with a question back, not with you already know, a direct answer. Victoria looked at him. All right, John took a deep breath. Why did you buy the shares? At the beginning, when nobody would have bet a single cent, he paused. Not in the company, in me. The silence lasted longer than the others. Victoria set down the cloth she was holding on the counter with that precise movement he knew so well. And then she did something he didn't expect. She answered without any hesitation at all, because I saw someone who had more ability than they realized. She looked at him directly, without looking away. Someone who, when they stopped trying to look like they knew everything, could see what everyone else was missing. Who had the kind of intelligence that doesn't show up in presentations but shows up in the choices nobody's watching. A pause. And I thought that person deserved a real chance to find out what they were capable of. John was silent. even if they didn't know you had given them that chance, especially because of that. He looked at her for a long moment. I wasted a lot, Victoria. Yes, she didn't soften it. She never did. But you're here. In your bakery. In our bakery. She picked the cloth back up. You've worked here for a year. This isn't just mine anymore. John blinked. It was the first time she had said that. Ours. A small word, the kind that changes the size of a room. He stood looking at her as she had already gone back to wiping down the counter with her usual efficiency, as if she hadn't said anything in particular. Victoria. Thank you. She didn't stop cleaning, but something shifted in the angle of her shoulders. A small relaxation, almost imperceptible, the kind that happens when a tension you've carried for a very long time finally finds a place to land. You're welcome, she said. In the weeks that followed, life moved forward with that specific quality of things that are in the right place. The bakery grew a little more, not in scale, not in units or expansion projections. It grew because it was good, because people came back, because there was something about that place, that small kitchen, that alley with a nameless tree, that made people want to stay a little longer. John still knocked things over occasionally. Victoria still corrected with the same precision as always. May still hummed songs with no name. And on the other side of the city, Caldwell Corp began slowly to look like what it should have been from the very beginning. Decisions made with care, people heard before being dismissed, numbers that added up because they were real and not because they were presented in a way that looked real. Isabella held on to 49%. Quiet, strategic, present. The kind of presence that doesn't leave and doesn't need to announce that it stayed. Victoria knew that. And she worked with that in mind every single day. On an afternoon in December, with the cold beginning to settle over San Francisco, the quiet way the cold settled there, John was closing up the bakery when he found something at the back of the drawer under the register. A folded piece of paper. He opened it. It was the ingredient list from the first recipe he had tried to make at the bakery, written in Victoria's handwriting with the corrections she had made beside each item in smaller, sharper letters. Less yeast, more time, not force. He stood looking at the paper for a moment, then folded it back up, put it in his pocket, and went to turn off the lights. Victoria was at the back door, coat over her arm, waiting to lock up. I found this, he said, holding up the paper. She looked. From the first week. Yes, you kept it? It was in the drawer. You never throw anything away. Some things deserve to stay. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped out into the alley and he followed, and they stood for a moment in front of the nameless tree while John locked the door. You still haven't looked up its name, he said. No? You're never going to look it up? Victoria looked at the tree. Maybe some things, she said, with that calm voice that had taken him years to learn to really hear, don't need a name to be exactly what they are. John looked at her, and this time he didn't let the silence answer. Victoria, she looked at him. I know I've been late to almost everything, he said, to listening, to seeing, to understanding what was right in front of me the whole time. A pause. But I don't want to be late to this. Victoria went still. Late to what? To saying that I don't want this. He made a small gesture that took in the alley, the tree, the closed bakery, the two of them standing in the December cold. To just be a job, or just a fresh start, or just the place where I learned to measure flour without overdoing it. The wind came through. A leaf fell from the nameless tree. Victoria looked at him for a moment with that expression he had called coldness for years, and which he now knew was something else entirely. It was attention. It was the way she had of taking something seriously. You are consistent about being late, she said, finally. I know. But when you get there... She paused for just a beat. You get there for real. And that was the closest thing to a yes that Victoria Sterling had said out loud in many years. John smiled. She didn't smile back. But there was something in her eyes that was better than a smile. It was certainty. Later that night, on the other side of the city, Isabella Carter was alone in the office that had been John's and had been hers and now belonged to Victoria. She wasn't there with permission. She was there because 49% still gave her access. And because Isabella Carter had never confused losing a battle with losing the war, she opened the laptop. The research was there, right where she had left it last time. She looked at the screen for a moment, then closed it, opened a blank document, and started typing, slowly, carefully, with the calm of someone who has time. That same night, without either of them knowing about the other, John and Victoria stayed up later than usual. John, in the small apartment with the porch, rereading the folded piece of paper in his pocket. Less yeast. More time. Not force. Victoria had gone back to the empty bakery and sat at the kitchen table, with the notebook open to the last page. She looked at the most recent line. Not enough. And below it, in the same firm handwriting, she added one last line. But it was the right beginning. She closed the notebook, turned off the light, and walked out through the alley, past the nameless tree that was still exactly where it had always been. In the right place. Without needing an explanation. Because in the end, that is the truth this whole story had been trying to tell from the very beginning. Not everyone who makes the most noise is the one who matters most. Not everyone who shows up smiling is the one who stays. And sometimes, the person you needed to see had been right by your side since day one. While you were trusting the ones who came later, and letting the one who was always there just pass you by. So tell me, at what point did you realize everything was changing? Would you have made the same choices, or would you have listened sooner? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And on a scale of 0 to 10, what score does this story deserve from you? If this story kept you hooked all the way to the end, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Because there are plenty more stories that start out quiet, but change everything by the end. See you in the next one.